Discover the Our MedTech Lives podcast, where industry experts share their career stories, key achievements, and insights into overcoming challenges in the MedTech field. Hosted by Zilka Rima and Kash Ikram.
Welcome to a new episode of Our MedTech Lives. Today's episode arrives at a perfect moment with the release of her new book, The $1 Billion Blind Spot: Why Women's Health is the Investment Opportunity of Our Time. Our guest, Maryann Selfe, argues that women's health isn't just underfunded. It's been fundamentally misunderstood as a market. Having spent 2 decades of advising ultra-high net worth individuals, family offices, and institutional investors on capital allocation across public and private markets, she has witnessed firsthand how entire categories are overlooked in investment frameworks. For MedTech founders and leaders, this raises a critical question. Are we building into one of the largest untapped opportunities in healthcare, or are we still designing companies around outdated assumptions? A very warm welcome to Maryann.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here, Silke and Kash. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, same here. Maryann, delighted. Thank you very much for joining the podcast. So first, let's get to know you a little better. Can you tell us something about yourself and your background?
I was born and raised in Nigeria, and my father was an entrepreneur, and he taught me about the value of hard work, and he taught me very importantly that the most important stories are the stories that you tell yourself, because the world will have stories about, who you could be and who you should be. But the most important of those stories is the one that you're telling yourself. And that's something that has stayed with me all my life. And it's also why I wrote the book about women's health as an investment opportunity. And my mother taught me to be kind. She always, I think the one story that I take away from my mother is that she always taught us, my siblings and I, to always be kind. She said to me, in everything that you do, always remember that there is a person at the other end of everything, at the other end of the line, a phone call, a letter, an email, a deal, a transaction. It's a human being, and you don't know what's going on in their lives. So be kind. And especially when it's hardest to be kind, that's when it matters the most. So I've grown up with that, and I got into banking. I sort of fell into banking. I spent my life in institutional finance. I started out as an investment banker, and then I transitioned into wealth and asset management. As Silke mentioned, I've spent over 20 years advising institutional clients, both institutional clients and family offices, or individual clients as well. Mm-hmm. And I think the one thread that's run through my career has really been this thread of looking for investment opportunities for my clients, whether they are institutional or individual clients. And that means an investment solution that is fit for the client, that meets their needs, it meets their investment objectives, their risk horizon, and so on. So that's really one thread that's run through my career. And I think one of the things that has stayed with me over time is that some of the best ideas, or some of the best investment solutions that we have executed, were those that we kind of identified before they became mainstream. I think by the time every man and his dog is talking about a stock or a bond or a company, part of the upside is gone. And so that's kind of what I spent my professional life doing. And not just identifying the broad themes where it makes sense, where the broad themes that are mispriced, but also once you've identified those broad themes that are mispriced, how do you then execute on that theme? How do you replicate that idea in a portfolio? Because it's great that a theme is mispriced, but a theme being mispriced doesn't mean you're going to make a return on it. So the execution matters just as much, or actually, I think in my experience, the execution matters more than identifying the theme itself. And I talk about that in the book. So I've spent a good part of my career identifying, the funds the fund vehicles. What vehicles should we use to execute this theme in our portfolio? What managers should we back? What structures should we use? What makes the most sense? Which will allow us to receive that return or to realize that return that we see in this mispriced theme. So that's what I've done my whole career. And I think for me, it was a no-brainer when I started kind of looking closer at healthcare, as a sector, and just recognizing the huge opportunity that we have, within women's health in particular. I mean, healthcare in general, I think, is at an inflection point, but in women's health in particular. And that's what led me on this journey and led me to this podcast that we're talking about right now.
That's great. I mean, you've spent decades investing and helping to allocate billions of dollars of capital, but it wasn't just that aspect that led you to think about women's health, right? Selfe tells me there's also a personal story behind it.
Yes, indeed. And I think that one of the things that I find also as an investor is, and particularly in healthcare, and we can talk about this in a bit, but healthcare is hard. Healthcare is complex. Healthcare is bureaucratic.
Welcome to our world, Maryann.
Which brings me back to, how do you execute on that? Because healthcare is not for the faint at heart. But I also find that the personal stories are important because as a founder, as an operator building in healthcare, you need a good dose of resilience. And sometimes, well, not sometimes, but most of the time, your level of resilience is always linked to your why. And so for me, the personal stories are super important. Two things, I think maybe I'll start with a friend of mine. I'll call her Ruth for the purposes of this conversation. But Ruth is one of the most capable women I know. And she's lived with unexplainable pain for the best part of 3 decades. At first, she thought it was a sport injury, started in her teens, this low-grade, low back pain that just would never go away. And so she thought it was a sport injury. And so she just kind of pushed through. It got worse. She self-medicated. She just got on with her day as the pain got worse and worse. And then it escalated. Hospitalizations. There were also emergency physicians, neurologists, you name it, different specialists, all trying to kind of identify and rule out what was the problem. They tested for everything. Lyme's disease, multiple sclerosis, HIV, every test came back inconclusive. But over time, I think 30 years later, Ruth finally got a diagnosis. It finally had a name. It was endometriosis. It had been endometriosis all along. And she finally had the surgery. I mean, by the time it was diagnosed, she then had the surgery to sort that out. But because of the delay, it's over 30 years, the damage, by the time they found it, the damage was extensive. And so was the surgery that followed. Now, I wish I could tell you that this is a story that's unique to Ruth, but it isn't. Endometriosis affects 1 out of every 10 women of childbearing age. It's a huge problem. And, I also went through my own health journey, and I write about this in the book. I suffer from uterine fibroids, which is a condition that up to 80% of women by the time they get to the age of 50 will experience. So we're not talking about a low-grade problem. It's a problem at scale. And, I think you get to this point where you're sort of, taking all of these stories, into account, and you're thinking, well, hold on a second. This doesn't sound right. Why is it that for a condition that affects millions of women worldwide, why are the solutions so limited? And I think importantly, why do we consider this acceptable? And so that's kind of how I started looking into, this is kind of how I started getting into this journey, right. And then realizing that actually, this is not just a gap, but this is a huge opportunity. And that's why I wrote.
Yeah. In your book is called The $1 Billion Blind Spots. Why has such a large market been ignored for so long? And in your book, you say it has been systematically ignored.
Yeah, I think it's, as I said, when I kind of started going on this journey, I realized that women's health was not just under-researched, because that's what I kind of thought was the main problem. But it has been, as you rightly mentioned, Selke, has been systematically underfunded. I mean, less than 2% of the global health research budget
Wow.
is linked or is targeted at female specific conditions, and that's huge. And when you look at that, it doesn't just tell you, or it doesn't just tell us about the medical field. It also tells us something about capital allocation, because when we systematically exclude women from clinical trials, as we did for decades,
Mhm.
we create data gaps,
Right.
we create knowledge gaps. And those data and knowledge gaps translate into incomplete models, incomplete medical models, incomplete scientific models, which then translate into incomplete investment and advisory frameworks that we use as investors to underwrite this risk. Suddenly, something feels very risky, not because it is risky or not because it is more risky, but it's because we're using incomplete frameworks. We have data, we have gaps in the data, which means that we cannot calculate, or we cannot model the risk as accurately as we should. So I think this is one reason why, this women's health has been, underfunded. And here I really also speak about private capital, coming into commercialized solutions. So I think the gap in data is one thing. I think the second thing is that, if you look at sort of like investment committees, and I have had the good fortune to sit on a few during my 20 odd years experience in the financial world, but I generally tended to sometimes be the only woman sitting on investment committees. The truth of the matter is that the vast majority of capital allocators are male, and I think that, first of all, men do not live this problem that women have. You are coming at it from there isn't that lived experience as well that kind of helps to contextualize things. But I think more importantly is that, as a society, we have not socialized men. We have not brought up men with the understanding that women's health is a serious investment opportunity. Yes, we see it as diversity and inclusion. And maybe we see it as impact, or maybe we see it as philanthropy or charity, but not a serious investment category. And so if I think about how that translates with some of the companies that I work with, the companies solving for, say, endometriosis, which is a big problem, by the way, we're talking about 200 million patients worldwide. You almost don't get the same sort of excitement as when you're in front of, say, an investor's pitching. You almost don't get the same sort of excitement like a company sort of, say, solving for oncology, for example.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that solving for endometriosis is less worthy than solving for oncology. It's just the socialization. I think that's, yeah. And I think, yeah, so that's, and I think the third, which is probably the hardest one to crack, is that the cultural overhang is real, and it operates at a level that is subconscious. And what do I mean by this? Culturally, we have been socialized to understand that a woman's pain is personal, a woman's pain is private. It's not something that you solve for. It's not something you talk about, let alone solve for at scale, let alone monetize. I'll give you an example. One of the founders in my book, it's a great lady who is come up with a device. It's the first in the world. It's a miscarriage prevention device. Women going through IVF, for example, tend not produce progesterone normally. Progesterone is the hormone that a woman produces when she gets pregnant, and progesterone basically prevents the woman from miscarrying that pregnancy. But when you go through assisted fertility, your body does not naturally produce progesterone. So you have to provide progesterone artificially. The therapeutic progesterone is, that's clear. The therapeutic works. The problem is at the delivery level. The delivery is broken. And progesterone today, you can deliver progesterone either orally, which doesn't work, by the way, because the body doesn't absorb it, through injections. Liquid progesterone is an oil-based solution. So you need to have very thick needles, which is very painful. And these injections are daily. They are so painful that women actually abort the injections at the risk of losing the pregnancy, which if you go through IVF, it's a huge emotional journey. And the third is vaginal, but it leaks, and it leaks so badly that sometimes you're not sure how much the body has absorbed, if it has absorbed enough, which then leads women in these situations to also be dealing with anxiety. And she's come up with a solution, which basically means that you can apply vaginal progesterone with no leaks. But imagine going into an investment committee,
Yes.
which is full of men, to pitch your solution. It's tough. It's a tough sell.
It is, and I totally get that cultural aspect that you're talking about, and because there's a reel on Facebook or something that talks about that gentleman in, I think, in India, who developed low-cost menstrual pads, right? But he was ostracized by his family, ostracized by his village. He was his wife even left him for a while, and now it's a huge business, right? And he's extremely doing very well providing these, but it just shows the cultural shunning that he had to go through. And I just want to make another comment, which links to another podcast we did with Gardner Harris, who wrote the book No More Tears, which talks about Johnson & Johnson. And I was struck when I read that book. He talks about 9 products that Johnson & Johnson produced, but 4 or 5 of them, I think, were directly affecting women. So, his claims about Johnson's baby powder and the link to ovarian cancer, for example. He talks also about ortho-evra claiming that there was a cause of blood clots and strokes from this hormone exposure, and of course Prolift vaginal mesh, and reports of severe pelvic injuries and painful complications that women went through that he writes about in his book. And we know that orthopedic implants like hip replacements, a lot of women are getting that due to the late stage osteoporosis they get later in life. So, I'm wondering, is it not just a lack of investment, but when there are products designed for women, there isn't enough oversight and further investment goes in to make sure that these are safe and effective, right? And that we're not leaving these, I'm going to call them orphan diseases that affect women, that there is no solution for, right? So maybe the landscape is very diverse in that there's some areas where there's no investment, there's some areas where there are products, but they're not optimal, and there's some areas where there's little investment. So it seems like a fascinating area for people to look into and to work on, right? Women being 50% of the population, right? But there are certain diseases that for women that can be of a particular focus: menopause care, hormonal health, fertility, obviously cardiovascular effects of women. There's a lot longevity. We talk a lot about longevity on our podcast. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on why there has been this lack of focus. Maybe from not the investor world, but because the investors come after the medical people say, hey, we want you to invest in this. But until they say, we want you to invest in this, it becomes not a topic for investors. But why, from your research, is there any particular reason why you think that women's health hasn't been in focus?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And I read the book No More Tears. It was very enlightening. It was a very enlightening read. And I mean, there are lots of reasons, and I go into this in the book, from a historical point of view, why this situation has persisted. And I really did that in the book, not because I sort of want to revisit the past, but because I think that it's super important that if we want to move forward, we need to get a sense of where we're coming from. And so I kind of cover, in the book, I talk about, first of all, the fact that women were excluded altogether, which then created these data gaps. But I think importantly, when the NIH then mandated in 93 that women should be included in clinical trials, that women should be part of these cohorts, that we follow, that we get longitudinal studies and so on, it still wasn't done. And it's not because people were doing that out of malice or just because they didn't want to include women, but there were structural reasons, and each one a little decision, one little decision here and there, but together, all those little decisions sort of meant that even though we have a regulatory body saying women are mandated to be included in clinical trials, it still wasn't happening. I mean, if we look today, for example, the last data point I saw on cardiovascular research, I mean, we know today that cardiovascular disease is not a man's disease only. Cardiovascular disease is the biggest killer of women worldwide, and most women are not even aware of this. It's bigger than cancer. But when I look at clinical trials, for example, for women for cardiovascular disease, the last number I saw, I think it's only 22% women are included. I mean, there are a number of reasons, for that low number, but I will caveat this by saying the number is improving. It's still not where we want it to be, but the direction of travel is good. So there is a number of historic reasons why this situation has persisted even till date. But I think for me, the good news and what makes me, what excites me a lot is the direction of travel. I mean, we just saw in January of last year, the FDA put out a mandate about sex as an important biological variable when it comes to, drugs, therapeutics, devices, and so on. The UK, the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK, which is sort of like the largest paid payer organization in the world. I've forgotten exactly, but I know it's one of the largest ones. They have just put out a women's health strategy, which includes a dedicated sort of track for women's health innovation. And so for me, when I kind of think about it as investors, yes, we do come in later, but some investors come in early. Some investors actually come in as early as once we have the evidence, scientific evidence for a solution. So investors come in as early as helping to develop, the proof of concept, for example, helping to get the clinical regulatory approvals and so on before the commercialization journey actually begins. So when I kind of look back over the last, I say 2-3 years, the signals from regulators, from major hospital services like the National Health Service in the UK, coming up with mandates that are meant to fast track and ensure the inclusion of sex as a biological variable in the provision of healthcare and healthcare services. This is super exciting because it means for us as private investors, and I say this as private investors because for that drug, for that therapeutic, for that device to reach the women who need it, we need private investors to come in to commercialize. So for me, it's really exciting because it means 100%. That this is now de-risking that entry for private investors to come in and commercialize. So this makes me really excited, when I look at everything that is happening, with governments, with regulators, really taking sex more importantly as a biological variable. I think I am optimistic about the future.
Maryann, we have recorded a lot of episodes about minimal invasive therapies, about robotics, but in your book, you refer to, and I quoted, amputation level interventions as a benchmark for certain procedures. Can you explain that in more details to us, please?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and I'm happy to talk about that. I think that for still quite a lot of issues that are female specific, we still do not have, benchmark solutions that are super innovative for a number of reasons. And I'll give you an example. If a woman suffers from very heavy menstrual bleeding of a certain prognosis and size, the default intervention is a hysterectomy, is the removal of the uterus so that we solve that problem permanently. And this is wide ranging in a number of female specific conditions. A woman has endometriosis of a certain size and prognosis, let's take out the uterus and so on. I mean, it's, and I refer to it as amputation level procedure because now we have research that shows us conclusively that a woman's uterus is not just for having babies. It's an endocrine gland. So when you take out an endocrine gland, it has downstream implications holistically on other parts of the body. Today, we know scientifically that if you take out a woman's uterus before the age of 50, you massively increase her risks to cardiovascular disease, to dementia, to Alzheimer's. These are not small risks. And so that's what I mean by that the current sort of standard of care that we have for a lot of wide ranging female specific conditions are not, it's not the gold standard that we should have today in 2026. I do recognize, of course, that there are innovations, which are this gold standard that we speak about, but there are barriers which mean that the level of adoption in the clinics to the women who need it were not there yet. And this is also one of the things that I write about in the book. And as an investor who is looking to invest in healthcare or to invest in women's health or healthcare in general, it's not enough investing in the topic. It's not enough to say, yeah, governments are talking about women's health, so I'm going to get into women's health. It's not enough. There are more things that you need to consider. Obviously, we need to look at the problem. We need to look at different things. But importantly, can the team who's working on this solution actually deliver on this to make this device or this solution one that is adopted by hospitals and gets to patients? Because that is very
Maryann, you mentioned earlier, healthcare is not for the faint-hearted. I 100% agree with you on that one. I think also, but on the flip side, the returns are good in healthcare, right? As an investor. To help us get into the investor mindset, because investors are also quite diverse in terms of why they're investing and are they big venture capitalists, are they angel investors, and what their motivations are. But when you talk to investors, help us get into the investor mindset. What happens inside these investor meetings? How do they categorize women's health, and what are these conversations like that you're having?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Cash. I think there are two angles to this. I think the first one is obviously if you are a general healthcare investor. I think for a lot of general healthcare investors, they don't particularly see women's health as a category. And I think this is also a problem for women's health, because I think with women's health, or for women's health as a category, there is a classification problem that actively works against it. Because as you rightly say, if I am a generalist healthcare investor and we're preparing for an IC and I have an investment committee and I have an investment analyst who's preparing the memo, and the analyst is looking at a women's health company who is working on a therapeutics, for example, where does the analyst classify that? Is it, what is he looking at? And I think the analyst will classify it based on what the company is doing. So if it's therapeutics, it's probably going to file it under biotech. If it's a company that's working on a diagnostic, for example, it's probably going to file it under under MedTech. If it's a company that's creating apps or trackers, it's probably going to file it under maybe consumer health or digital health. And so as a generalist, I feel that right now we are not in a situation where a lot of investors kind of look at women's health holistically. So that, because it's only when you look at it holistically that you can step back and have the strategic conversation about, should we have a structural allocation to women's health as a sector? So this is not a conversation that would most likely be happening with a generalist investor. They would be looking at either, and I spoke to an investor the other day who said to me, who had invested in a women's health company, and he said to me, I invested in a MedTech company. So that's on the generalist side. And this actively works against women's health, because then you're not having people who are kind of taking that holistic view to then make strategic discussion or decisions around building allocations to women's health. But I think the good news is that there are dedicated women's health vehicles. There's not a lot of them, but there are. And that's great, because the more vehicles that are dedicated that we have, the more we can begin to sort of bucket women's health or cluster it as a bucket, and we can then run comparables. But to answer your question more directly, I think for us in an investment committee, when we're looking at a company, I think the question always starts with, and this is sort of the framework, and I go into it in the book, but I think first thing we look at the problem, is this really a problem? And a lot of founders in women's health, we talked about the resilience earlier and the why. And what I love about people who are working in women's health is that they usually have a a personal story that connects to the why, which is really powerful, which is fantastic because you will bang your head against the wall many times and you need that level of resilience to push through. But I think that, as an investor, again, you need to think about the investor wants to win. So how can you help the investor win? So when I'm looking at the problem, it's not enough to know that you had the problem or your grandma had the problem. I want to know, is this a problem that affects many people and how many? How big is this problem? Kind of what I want to know. The other thing that I want to know, which is a bit of a bugbear, is if you tell me this is a problem that affects women, I'm most likely not going to invest because women are different. I'm a woman, Silke, you're a woman. Mm-hmm. But I guarantee that, our preferences, things are different, right? And so just saying women for me doesn't quite cut it. You need to be really specific. Who is the woman you're targeting? And you need to also be able to demonstrate that you can reach that woman. Because with healthcare, I think one of the things when it comes to scaling is you will find that if the women you are talking to are so fragmented, maybe demographically, geographically, whatever, you might find that it is so difficult or expensive to scale to reach those women. Suddenly you're having to deal with different payers in different geographies with different, processes and so on. And then it's just, you're targeting women, but you haven't defined your market properly. So we look at the problem and how big it is. I want to know about the solution you're coming up with and why it's the right solution. But I think importantly, I'm not so focused on the solution. And I think a lot of investors aren't really. I don't really care about the solution. I care more that you are in love with the problem. Because when you are in love with the problem, you will learn every day. You are talking to the people who are living the problem in the clinics, you're looking at the workflows. You will learn every day. And maybe the solution that you thought was the right solution at the beginning will evolve to something else. So if I see, as investors, we see that you are really focused on the solution, that's it's a bit of a red flag, because I think you should be more focused on solving the problem as opposed to your solution. And then, of course, we look at the team, and, for us, it's super important that this is a team that have the capability to deliver this, to sell into payers, to sell into hospitals. Selling to hospitals is hard work, and understanding really who pays. Healthcare is one of those strange areas where you have the agency problem. The person who needs the solution is not the one who's paying for it. So we look at the team to say, do they have the capability on their bench to sell successfully into healthcare institutions? And if they don't, do they have the self-awareness that they don't? And therefore, they have a robust mitigation plan. So I think these are some of the things that, we talk about, we debate a lot. Mm-hmm. When we're looking at healthcare companies.
But the positive thing is, you say in your book as well that the women's market is now accelerating. What are the signals that it's not only a hype, but a real structural shift in capital flows?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that when we look at women's health, yes, there is a lot of hype, and it's also why it's also one of the things that we talk about a lot when we're looking at diligence. And if you are doing it yourself, you need to really make sure that you fully understand what is hype and what is real, what's signal and what's noise. There is really a lot of hype, particularly around the fact that women's health is one of those areas that, as we know, has not had a lot of research over the last decade. So there are solutions out there that promise, everything, and taking advantage of the fact that we really don't have a lot of research, and women are desperate for solutions that will improve their quality of life. So there is that. But I think that if we kind of step away from the hype, I think if we just look at capital flows, where the money is going, where the smart money is going, that is very encouraging. I mean, the last data point that I saw from the Silicon Valley Bank, who puts out a yearly, an annual sort of review of the sector, we could see, like, between 2019 and 2024, like a huge increase in capital flowing into women's health. I think the last in 2020 was about 10.7 billion flowing into women's health. So a huge, massive increase from 2000. And so just looking at the projection of capital going into the space, over the last 5 years, I think it's really clear, the direction of travel. But I think what excites me more is almost this evolution from kind of like femtech to women's health or the health of a woman. And what do I mean by this? I mean, in the early days of women's health, we had the term femtech, which was to sort of categorize those solutions that were being developed around about 2019 and so on. And a lot of these solutions were trackers for, fertility, for, the menstrual period and so on. And so I think the category sort of needed a name to encompass all of that. And so I think in the beginning, when you also look at more granular, where's the capital been flowing? What you tend to see is that in, say, 2019, 2020, the majority of the capital was going towards reproductive health solutions. When I look now, like if we look at the last 2024 data, for example, we see that a lot of the majority of that 10.7 billion went into things like, biopharma, oncology, really solutions that look at the woman holistically, like whole of life, as opposed to, just reproductive health. So that's exciting. And I think also, if you look at the deals that we've seen this year, I think Q1, we've seen a really big increase in the appetite, in M&A appetite in healthcare. And it's obviously no wonder because, the pharma industry is facing one of the steepest patent cliffs that they've had in a while. But I think if I look at the last, if I just take Q1 as an example, Gilead paid $5 billion for a Munich biotech company for their ADC, the antibody drug conjugate technology platform. And the first indication for that on that platform is a women's health indication, ovarian cancer. Now, Gilead is not doing that because they just kind of want to spend $5 billion, but they really see the potential there. And I think Lilly, last week paid $7 billion for Calonia, I think it was, for their in vivo CAR T clinical. They just did a clinical trial on 4 patients, and Eli paid $7 billion for that. Now, yes, CAR T is oncology, but what Calonia have said, what the company have said is, the next indications for this, assuming the technology works, in vivo CAR T works, the next indications are autoimmune disease, lupus, and these are diseases that affect, I think, more than 80% of sufferers are women. So when I kind of look at the direction of travel in terms of how capital has flowed over, say, the last 6 years, and I also look at the appetite, the M&A appetite of strategic acquirers already in Q1 of 26, I think it's
clear that there's light at the end of the tunnel, and maybe we're turning a corner. I was last week at the BSGE meeting in London, at the gynecology endoscopic meeting, and there are companies that are very much focused on women's health. I'm thinking of Hologic, Theramex, companies like that. Now, I love the title of your book, right? The $1 billion blind spot. Who is your book aimed at? More specifically, who should be reading your book?
I wrote the book. Actually, I think when I wrote the book, I was writing it initially for investment professionals, for people like me who are the trusted advisors of ultra high net worth clients, family offices, and so on. And the truth of the matter is that we are at an inflection point. We know there is the great wealth transfer, which is happening right now. $24 trillion is changing hands between generations, from the baby boomers to the next generation. And we know that the majority of those who stand to inherit that wealth are women in their 50s and 60s. So for me, the important thing here is not the size of the shift in capital, although that matters immensely. What matters more is the shift in perspective, because we're not just looking at a transfer of assets. We're looking at a transfer of perspective. For the first time in history, we have capital, people with the lived experiences of gaps in the healthcare system and decision-making power converging in the same hands. This is not a social shift. This is a capital markets event. And nowhere will this be felt more than in women's health, because women's wealth and women's health are not two separate conversations. They are two sides of the same coin. And so for me, when I was thinking about this and looking at the opportunities that I was seeing in women's health, I thought, look, for investment professionals, for private bankers, for people who work with ultra high net worth clients, for lawyers, advisors who are working with these clients, it is not, the question is not whether this topic will come up in conversation. It will. The question is, are the frameworks that we use, have they been built for the capital owner of the past or the capital owner that is here in front of us and changing?
Right.
So that's who I wrote the book for primarily. But I think also I wrote the book also for people who are building in this space. Because oftentimes, and in my work with healthcare operators and founders, in this space, as I said, there is a lot of passion. The work comes from a deep place. And so a lot of us in this space tend to lead with the passion, but passion doesn't pay the bills. And so I wanted founders or operators in this space to kind of see behind the scenes, how do investors think about these opportunities? What is important to an investor who's evaluating in this space? I also know that I think one of the hardest when it comes to raising capital, fundraising, I know that it's really hard to raise as a woman. I think the last statistic I saw was that less than 2% of VC capital goes to women. And it also happens coincidentally that a lot of the founders working in women's health are, guess what, women. So it's double whammy. So I sort of wrote it also for founders or people working in healthcare to kind of see behind the scenes, how do we think about these opportunities? And really for anyone who is interested in closing or anyone who believes that the greatest gap in modern healthcare needs to be closed. That's what I wrote the book for.
Exactly. Selke, you started in banking. Do you have millions in the bank that you're hiding from me? You're gonna be paying for dinner tomorrow night if that's the case.
Cash, why are you talking now about millions when you just say you love the word billion?
Yeah,
So,
I know
Maryann,
if you have billions. I would know if you had billions.
but Maryann maybe has. If you were allocating $1 billion today, what specific areas in women's health would you prioritize and why?
I think that's an easy one. So first of all, really, I'm looking at diagnostics here, specifically non-invasive diagnostics for conditions with historically long diagnostic timelines. I think that's one. Also, with I'm really excited about AI and what we can do with machine learning in surfacing diagnostics earlier and faster. So that's an area of focus. I would also be looking at sex-specific therapeutics, so drugs and devices that have been developed with the female biology. I think if we really get it right, with therapeutics that are sex-specific, we don't need to create a market because what exists currently underperforms for half the population. So sex-specific therapeutics, I'm really excited also about drug delivery, drug discovery, drug development, drug delivery, also with, digital technology and AI, really excited. I think there's a lot of opportunity in drug delivery and drug development and discovery. So that's another area that I'll be looking at. And I think the third area is really infrastructure, who's building out the rails for ensuring that we can deliver care to where we need it. I'm thinking about companies working at the intersection of the data infrastructure. We know also that garbage in, garbage out with AI models, and we know we don't really have a lot of data on women. So companies working at the intersection of data, working at the intersection of infrastructure that improves clinical workflows. So that's digital health technology or digital health infrastructure. That's that other area focus. That's where we see opportunity.
I think your book is a perfect center of a Venn diagram, which is finance, healthcare innovation, long-term demographic trends that are happening today, and women's health, which is essentially what you're saying is a blue ocean, right? There's not many competitors there, and it's a huge market, right? Now, in addition to that, in your spare time, you also are president of Femi Health Alliance. So,
Yes.
what's the mission of Femi Health Alliance?
Yes, we are Femhealth Alliance is a Swiss nonprofit, association, and we set it up really to mobilize capital into women's health innovation. We have sort of three streams that we work on. The first stream is awareness. So we create podcasts, we create newsletters, and we have a sister newsletter platform which reaches almost 20,000 readers in 110 countries. And so we just use that as the first layer to create the awareness of sex as an important biological variable. And then the second layer is education. We convene events, either online or in person, where we bring together investors, we bring together founders, operators in the space, clinicians, scientists, just so that we can all try and speak the same language. Our next event is on the 27th of May. And there we have an investor, an institutional investor, a VC, and a company working on that have actually come up with a minimally invasive device that treats heavy menstrual bleeding. And I think it's important conversation so that investors in the room can see what it really takes to build a company that gets and build a technology that gets adopted in real life, but also for founders in the space to also get a sense around, what are the metrics and milestones that are important, are top of mind for investors as they are thinking about their next fundraising. And then the third layer is we convene people. So we have the education layer, and then we convene people, really different stakeholders across the ecosystem. So policy, scientists, investors, just so we can all speak a shared language in terms of maybe influencing policy or influencing, especially around Europe, where we have so many different jurisdictions, market access and that sort of thing, which at the end of the day helps to get innovation faster to the women and the patients who need it. So that's what we do with Femme Health Alliance. We have a mission to mobilize 1 billion into women's health innovation by 2035.
Oh, wow. So wind to your wings there. Absolutely. I mean, you've been on and you are on, I think, an incredible journey, right? And I'd be now at this point fascinated to know, what are the 3 things that you know now that you wish you'd known then?
This one I don't know. I think that what I know now that I didn't know then was when I first encountered all the gaps in women's health. I just saw them as gaps and I was gobsmacked. I just could not believe that we only, for example, used male mice to test pain medication, for example. And now we know that females use a completely different biological pathway to men in processing pain, which is why a lot of the sort of like the migraine medication, I'm a migraine sufferer myself, it doesn't work on me.
Right.
Because it's not targeting the biological pathway that I use to process pain. So at first I just saw it as a gap, but what I know now is it's such a huge opportunity. Oh my God, it's a huge opportunity. I think that's one thing. I think the second thing is that the exit market matters more than the entry market. And I think in the beginning, I spent years kind of focusing on over-analyzing which companies to back. But I think the more important question is, who is this company building for? So who is the acquirer that we're building for so that we get an exit? And then I think the third thing is that the personal and the professional are one and the same.
Yeah. Wow. Fascinating. Selfe often describes me as a pain, so I'm sorry to hear there's no cure for that, Selfe.
Go on with this.
Cash, we don't want to solve for your pain. No, we don't want to solve you. No.
This is not women's health. Sorry, Cash.
It's good to know.
Maryann, we are not sure if you had us in mind when writing your book, but Cash and I, we love building MedTech businesses, and we found it incredibly interesting to read. So your insights, especially your insights on how investors evaluate our work and the questions we need to answer at each stage, make your book incredible, valuable to read for all founders teams in MedTech and in any field, not only in women's health. So we wish you every success with your book. And we thank you for letting us feature you on our podcast to celebrate its publication today, actually.
Thank you so much. I appreciate
Great.
it. And it's a great conversation. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. Amazing conversation. Such an interesting topic. And I'm excited to see how this is going to evolve. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into our MedTech Lives. You have been listening to Zilka Rima and Tash Ikran. We're committed to bringing you insights and stories that inspire and inform the medical community. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your network.